Welcome to our first afternoon session. My name is Joost Joustra and I work as a postdoctoral fellow here at the Courtauld in the research forum. This panel is called Senses, plural. And as art historians, we see, we look at things, we use our eyes, but it does not end there. And even the most obvious of the senses in the art historian's toolkit, being sight, can be problematic. My own work at the Courtauld this year is themed Art of the Invisible and explores how artists through time have been preoccupied with things that are often not visible. Sight has limitations, and that is why we have other sensory tools in our toolkit. Art history in recent years has undergone a sensory turn. Something that is already apparent from the papers we heard yesterday and this morning. Art historians and artists listen, they touch, and they even taste. They also smell, mostly very good. Touching marble sculpture is a particular guilty pleasure of mine, I must admit. This panel has a slightly different structure than the previous ones. Our first two speakers, Beth Williamson and John Kannenberg, explore the role hearing plays in our discipline. And after their two papers, they will sit in front of the room and answer your questions. After that, the Courtauld Sussan Babaie will talk about taste, after which we will all experience the most exciting of the senses downstairs in the student cafe during our lunch. Now I would like to welcome Beth Williamson to the stage, and Beth is going to talk about seeing and hearing and not seeing and not hearing in medieval visual and material culture. Welcome, Beth Williamson.
Thank you. Well, despite the great value placed within modern academia on interdisciplinary research and upon intellectual exchange that crosses traditional disciplinary boundaries, it's undeniable that in producing such research, there's always some work of translation to be done. This translation involves not just reaching common understandings of discipline-specific technical language or other particular terms, but also involves adequately perceiving the questions and issues at hand within the various disciplines. As well, sorry, I didn't want that one yet. I'm having trouble looking at my presenter notes. Just give me a second. Bother. Here. So the translation involves not just adequately perceiving questions and issues at hand within the various disciplines, but also understanding histories and historiographies of those questions and issues. But I would say that it's often in looking beyond the current edges of our disciplines and borrowing analytical methods from elsewhere that scholars move their own disciplines forward. When art historians sought to widen their subjects and methods of analysis, opening up their assessments, sorry, I'm trying to multitask by trying to get this up to show presenter notes on here. There we go. Now I have something I can actually work with. When art historians sought to widen their subjects and methods of analysis, opening up their assessments of audience reaction and reception by considering senses other than sight, those working on the visual and material culture of religious devotion were among the first to take those routes. They reached into the toolboxes of geographers for their understandings of social space, and of musicologists and sound studies scholars for ways to treat the sounds that contribute to the sensory experience of religious praxis. In my own field, that of medieval religious culture, some of the early and still influential investigations into the other senses as a component in reception and understanding of material culture were by Byzantinists. Liz James considered other senses beyond sight as crucial to the beholder's experience of images. Bisera Pentcheva's research investigated the place of sound as interlinked with the other senses within the overall experience of visual and material culture. These studies, and others like them, have added greatly to the intellectual frameworks of art history and material culture studies over the past 15 years or so. This scholarship has introduced smell, touch, and sound along sight into the investigation of beholder experience and audience reception. And this is a welcome expansion of the methods and concerns of visual and material culture. However, speaking for my own area, that of medieval and early Renaissance religious culture, it is still sometimes the case that sound and music are treated as mere context or background. We can know what this means when we think about the sort of phenomenon that Alex was talking about yesterday, where you might be attending a history lecture and the lecturer feels bound to illustrate points by putting images up, not actually deal with them or do anything with them, but just to illustrate. And that sound is following that same pattern sometimes. So it's all very well to look at a stained glass window, such as the Jessie tree window here in Bristol Cathedral's Eastern Lady Chapel, and to know that sometimes it was viewed in the context of the sound of the O Radix Jessie antiphon. However, seeking only to explain, in inverted commas, the meaning of the image by reference to the words of that antiphon is not to take the music itself fully seriously, neither in terms of its own complexity of word-image relations, nor as a fully active and constitutive part of a multisensory religious experience. I myself started looking at music and sound as a way to think further into the embodied experience of religious devotion. And I should probably say at this point that art historical research into visual and material culture was already a cross-disciplinary move for me, having been trained as an undergraduate in history. So for me, art history seemed like a necessary direction in order to look more productively at the medieval culture that I was already interested in studying. In moving on then to pursue cross-disciplinary research with the addition of music and sound, I developed an interest in the relationships between sound and silence. Considering those relationships made me think differently about my own work on visual and material culture in several ways. On the one hand, I spent some time thinking about silences within music, such as the pauses in the middle of a medieval chanted psalm verse. In this context, the music hasn't stopped, the performance of the psalm is still ongoing, but in that pause, the sound is temporarily not there. To illustrate this, I show you here a typical simple chant. When the psalms were sung by monks and canons in their choirs, those on one side of the choir would sing the first verse, pausing in the middle of that verse. The singers then on the other side of the choir would then pick up fairly smartly from the end of one verse into the other, without much pause at that point, but then putting in a pause in the middle of the next verse. I'll show you what I mean with these few verses from Psalm 132. Now, I did think, of course, about bringing actual sound that you would hear through the speakers here. That often doesn't work, in my experience. I'm not very good at making that happen. But more to the point, I'm going to sing this for you, mainly because it always amuses Alex when I do this. So, for example, you've got on the left-hand side the first half of each verse, and on the right-hand side the second. So you might hear something like, Lord, remember David and all his afflictions, how he sware unto the Lord and vowed unto the mighty God of Jacob. I don't need to do the next one, not least because I can't sing tabernacle. That's a word to be avoided. So the pause in the psalm breaks up and frames the sound. It provides a moment for reflection, and it heightens the singer's and the audience's awareness of the presence of the music by relating it to an absence. Thinking about these presences and absences in sound made me then question or consider questions about invisibility or contingent visibility of images. So in a similar way, images that are invisible or difficult to see at a particular point, but whose existence is nonetheless well known to their patrons or to the users of the spaces that the images inhabit, are not present. They are present in a particular way. So Hagia Sophia's apse mosaic, for example, which is hard to see from the ground. If you compare this sort of image that we generally get in our books with an image taken from the floor, you can see the difficulties, the contingent visibility of that image. Liz James talked about this in a fundamental article about senses in art history, and she pointed further to the idea that at some points in the day it would be even more difficult to see it if it was dark or if there was incense or whatever there might be. So thinking about those kinds of experiences was something I became very interested in as a result, really, of thinking about those non-sounding moments in music. In another way, the sculpted busts up in the triforium of St. Vitus's Cathedral in Prague are a long way up. They're not easy to see, but the patron knew they were there. And they offer another example of such invisible or contingently visible images. In these cases, out of sight is not necessarily out of mind. So another way in which this out of discipline, or shall we say undisciplined thinking, moved my research on was in terms of considering the work of musical notation in particular instances of visual and material culture. There's a lot of this about. There's a lot of images of music making, and there's a lot of images of notation. As you can see just from these few random examples, many musical angels inhabit altarpieces, sculpture, stained glass, etc. And the general message of this angelic musicality is often fairly obvious: the offering of praises to God, the evocation of heaven's music on earth, etc. But often music, as it's represented in visual culture, in combination with other elements of the imagery in which it appears, and in concert with its context, suggests quite specific things, and it performs quite specific theological or devotional work as part of the ensemble. So today I'd like to consider the work of musical notation within two specific instances of medieval visual culture. One is a 15th century panel painting from Italy, and the other is a stained glass window in an English chapel. So, first, the Italian painting. In 1433, the Sienese painter Domenico di Bartolo produced this painting of the Madonna and Child, seated on the ground, surrounded by angels. Above the string player, to the Virgin's right, that is our left, music is incised against the gold background. The string player seems to be fixing his thoughts on the music, as if it might be emerging from his memory. This notation, faint but legible, has been transcribed by Timothy J. Dickey. He has suggested that the melody represents a Sienese lauda, a Sienese confraternity song, possibly sung by members of the Disciplinati confraternity of Saints Girolamo and Francesco in Siena. We have a sense also of the words that should presumably be understood as going with the notation. The two angels that peer over the Virgin's shoulder are singing. They tilt their heads together. Three words of an inscription, the lyrics of their song, can just be seen issuing from the conjunction of their brows into the air, though I can see that this is barely visible in reproduction. I know this to be the case. So, if we switch to a black and white detail, taken under different light and rotate it, I think you can probably just see the gold of the inscription a little bit better. And we can see that it reads, Adoramus te Christe, we adore you, O Christ. Now, the notation on the left-hand side of the painting doesn't match up with any known transcribed version of the Adoramus te, but it could well represent a hitherto unknown Sienese lauda on this text. Therefore, it's possible that for a contemporary viewer of this painting, perhaps a member of the Laudaci confraternity who had assembled in front of this panel or carried it in procession, the inscribed notation, together with the words Adoramus te Christe, might have represented a real and familiar piece of music, sung by confraternity members when they gathered in front of this painting. As well as this evocative function, making reference to real practice, the notation could do additional devotional work in suggesting that the sung praises to Christ never actually cease. The notation has a particular job to do, which supplements the texts that are visible to the viewer of the painting. texts invite the viewer into an engaged and active relationship with the painting and with the Virgin Mary as the key person depicted in that painting. They are considerably more visually obvious than the notation and the words of the Adoramus Te Christe. So this might indicate that there's a difference in ownership and audience between the texts on the scrolls and the notation and words inscribed in the background of the painting. The text scrolls, as you can see, are orientated to face the viewer, outside the picture plane. The music, on the other hand, seems to belong to the angels. The viewer in front of the painting can certainly choose to join with the angels in their sung praise of Christ, so he or she could sing, or perhaps even inwardly recall, the Adoramus Te Christe Lauda, which we're suggesting is what's depicted on the surface of the painting. But this is not the only way that the notation works here. The notation could serve also to concretize and extend the music, showing that the Lauda sung by the confraternity during their services does not stop when the human viewers disperse and walk away from the painting. The angels within the painting are shown as constantly singing, not just generalized angelic music, but a specific song, the confraternity's Adoramus Te Christe. The members of the confraternity could, of course, gather together to sing this from time to time with the angels. But when they're not there, the angels also sing it on their behalf, continually and eternally. Thus, the notation can work in two ways, or at least two ways, in two time frames. It can represent the devotional activity of the confraternity members and refer to specific occasions on which human song is voiced, even perhaps acting as a cue to musical performance in front of the painting. But it can also suggest a longer duration of time, the everlasting timelessness of the angelic praises. Moving to my second example then, this is one with which many of you will be familiar, I expect. This is the stained glass of the Chantry Chapel of Richard, Earl of Warwick, known as the Beauchamp Chapel. This chapel is well known as a sumptuously decorated space with fine sculpture, painting, and architectural decoration. And here's the east window there. The painted glass in its windows contains extensive and unusually detailed musical notation, though some lights have been subject to alteration and restoration. The east window, the high point of the chapel, used to be said to be almost entirely restored, but in fact more recent research suggests that much of the window, including much of the notation, is in fact 15th century. The tracery lights in this window set forth the music of the Gloria in scrolls held by cherubim and seraphim. The opening of the Gloria in Excelsis was always intoned solo by the celebrating priest at Mass. You may be familiar with this kind of thing, that even when you have a large, complex, polyphonic Gloria, it's nearly always that the beginning of that is intoned solo by a single voice, without the rest of the polyphony. But here, you can see that the Gloria appears as two-voice polyphony. So with one line running across the top, one line of notes there, and another there. This two-voice polyphony continues into the next part, the et in terra pax omnibus, here, so Deo, et in terra pax, etc. The notation's in fact missing from the stave in the next bit, but the double staves can clearly be seen either side of the text. So here you can see that there are spaces for the notation. I don't know whether the notation was never there, or what I suspect is that it was damaged and has been further damaged as part of the restoration, but I need to check that. The Laudamus Te section, which also lacks its notes, down here, has a single stave for plain song, and the rest of the Gloria then continues with that single stave and plain song, and with different notation, not the up-to-date 15th century mensural notation, that is, notation which indicates specific rhythm, which is depicted in the polyphonic Gloria section. The rest of it, the plain song, continues by using the older square neumes, which are more usually associated with plain song. And I'll just give you that there with a bit more detail so you can see what I mean. These are contemporary, modern, up-to-date, perhaps even radical notes of the 15th century which indicate particular rhythms. These are the much more traditional plainsong neumes, which give a general sense of rhythm and a general sense of pitch up and down, but are not the modern polyphonic notation. Alexandra Buckle has compared the melody of the surviving chant with contemporary and earlier Sarum graduals. She finds that it's fourth in the Sarum series of Gloria chants, used on principal and double feasts. It's therefore real music, recognisable as connected with important liturgical celebrations. And we know that the patron decreed that there should be a sung Mass to the Virgin Mary daily in this chapel. And so, at certain points in every day, whether it was a top festival or not, during that sung Mass, the visual attention paid by a viewer to the musical notation in this glass could have been aligned with the audible praises of human singers performing the angel's song of Gloria in Excelsis. And yet, in that daily Mass, the Gloria would likely not have been performed polyphonically, as it appears here. So what is this polyphony doing? Buckle's suggestion is that the polyphonic Gloria seeks to combine a general reference to the daily sung performance of the Mass with a more specific, evocative reference to the other use of the Gloria in Excelsis text in the liturgy. That is, at the first responsory of Matins on Christmas Day, so a specific service to one day in the year. In that office, reference is made to the angel's announcement of the birth of Christ to the shepherds, at which the heavenly host sing Gloria in Excelsis Deo. This is the first historical mention of that Gloria. So Buckle suggests that polyphonic embellishment may well have been a feature of this important and theatrical point in the Christmas Day liturgy in the Sarum Rite, so in the rite that was copied from Salisbury Cathedral, and that it may have been performed that way not only at Salisbury, but also in the Beauchamp Chapel. So the glass in Richard Beauchamp's chapel might suggest a fleeting but evocative reference to elaborate liturgical polyphonic performances of the Gloria as sung on Christmas morning, before it then goes on to complete the Gloria as performed under normal circumstances in plainsong during the everyday Mass. This seems perfectly plausible, but a wider question can be asked in relation to the devotional work that the notation is doing. Why is that specific reference made to Christmas Day Matins, and what effect does it have? Much of the answer to this question can only be speculative, but it is certain that in a private chapel such as this, the users, or at least the principal users of the chapel, would have been well aware of what was in those windows, even if a casual visitor couldn't easily have read them without instruction. To some extent, the work that the polyphonic notation does here is to draw attention to a very familiar text in a specific way. The Gloria would be so well known and so often heard that a viewer seeing it in the decoration of a space like this might even hardly notice it, or at least not think too much about it, considering it merely to represent the generalized Song of the Angels. But to see it accompanied, as here, by careful, realizable and unusual polyphonic notation gives pause for thought, and it encourages the viewer to take time and to think about the text and its meaning. To see the very unusual polyphonic Gloria creates further emphasis on that part of the text and embellishes it in such a way as to force the viewer to think of it as special. So it works in something of the same way as the illumination of an initial at the start of a text, or the placement of a miniature at the start of an important section of a devotional manuscript. For a viewer familiar with the theatrical performances of the Gloria in Christmas Day Matins, the lines of polyphonic notation would have taken that viewer's mind to the Christmas days of their memory, where they might have heard the text sung in these elaborate performative contexts. Besides this, though, by marking this liturgical text out in this way and making reference to Christmas Day Matins, rather than simply to the ordinary way in which the Gloria is sung every day, the notation in this window could also have taken the viewer's mind back beyond his or her own past to the specific and crucial moment of Christ's incarnation on earth, by evoking the angel's annunciation to the shepherds on that first Christmas morning. So notation here then embellishes and illuminates, but it also moves the viewer's thoughts in specific ways to specific moments of historical time, while simultaneously making reference to the daily round of the liturgy. Thus, this notation could stimulate an awareness of the idea which liturgical scholars have called the all-time, or the eternal today, of which medieval devotees were so aware. In this concept, medieval Christians understood that the events of the history of human salvation are happening in sequential layers, but also, as represented in the daily and yearly round of the liturgy, as repeated and repeating, and never strictly past or future. So this music then evokes time. It marks out a duration within which the real experience of a certain piece of music can take place. But it also evokes time in the wider senses of liturgical time and historical time. This work of referring to time is a feature that can be shared both by visual music, by notation such as this, and also, obviously, by sounding music. But there is one additional aspect to this visual, non-sounding music. When musical notation appears like this, where it's not necessarily, for example, a prompt for performance, it encourages the viewing devotee to notice specifically that this is representative of something that one ought to be able to hear, but cannot. So visual, but unheard music reminds the viewer that painted objects of the sort with which I've been dealing here today are only representations. While visual imagery can effectively direct the viewer towards the correct object of his or her devotion, it was important in medieval theology that the viewer didn't get stuck or fixated on the material. Successful devotional imagery, then, needed to operate strategies for encouraging the viewer to move in his or her devotional practices away from earthly images and sounds towards a higher level of spiritual engagement, in which the advanced devotee could perform devotions without recourse to sensory prompts. This material notation, this silent music, can do just that, by reminding the viewer that these representations are only pale imitations of the real holy persons and real heavenly environment to which they refer, and not the real thing. I'd just now like to take just 2 minutes to introduce to you a project that I've been running over the last 15 months or so with Bristol Cathedral on sound and silence within the contemporary experience of a religious space. With funding from the University of Bristol's Brigstow Institute, we investigated people's experience of sound and silence in Bristol Cathedral in a number of ways. We interviewed people who work or volunteer at the cathedral, including clergy, vergers, guides, and musicians. We interviewed visitors and members of the congregation. We also encouraged people to express their thoughts on paper via a comments box in the cathedral. 2 student composers were engaged to produce, and paid, I should say. It's nice to have money to give to people to do these things, to produce new compositions, engaging with the themes of sound and silence. Each one wrote for a different choir. One wrote for the cathedral choir, and one for the University of Bristol Women's Choir, the Schola Cantorum. We also had a sound artist engaged to produce a collage piece from snippets of recorded sounds and silences. We fed into Bristol Cathedral's participation in Open Doors Day by offering free talks on sound and silence in the church, and by employing a group of 5 singers to perform in different spaces in the building throughout the day. In addition, the singers were available to talk to visitors about their own experiences of sound and the ways in which those listening to the same pieces in different spaces perceived them differently. And finally, we presented all this at a public event, the Brigstow Institute's Research Showcase. All this exploratory work has now led to the Cathedral designating 2019 as the year in which its events programme and its interpretive and education work will all be themed around sound and silence. We're at present applying for further funding to extend the project and to produce some more permanent outputs of the research, including specially designed sound stations around the building where visitors will be able to hear music appropriate to the date of the different parts of the building. I end with this project partly just to draw it to your attention as something unexpected that I ended up doing as a result of an interest in religious spaces and in music. I would also note that sometimes moving beyond our disciplinary norms in terms of period, area and method can result in productive outcomes in terms of public engagement with some of the objects of our academic study. But I would finish by going back to my starting point, which is that besides the engagement potential, which is undoubtedly important, looking at and listening to materials outside of my own formal disciplinary training in history and art history has changed my own research, both in terms of the questions that I ask and, I think, in the ways that I attempt to answer those questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Beth, for that very harmonious paper. I'd like to invite our next speaker, the founder of the Museum of Portable Sound, John Kannenberg, who's going to talk to us about sound marks as objects of curatorial care, the exhibition of audio recordings with a museological context. Welcome, John.
Thank you very much. Apologies, I just need to get this set up. And sorry if you have heard this multiple times, I just want to make sure the sound is playing through the speakers. Okay. Once again, thank you very much. Thank you for the introduction and thank you for inviting me here, Fern. My name is John Kannenberg, and the title of my paper is Sound Marks as Objects of Curatorial Care, the Exhibition of Audio Recordings Within a Museological Context. That's only partially true about what I'm going to talk about today. I'm also going to be telling you about the museum that I created and that I serve as the director of, through which I've tested my ideas about how to display sound in a museum, and that museum is called the Museum of Portable Sound. The Museum of Portable Sound is a portable museum that exists on a mobile phone, a single mobile phone, this one in fact, now that I've gotten that out of the way, I need to get this out of the way. I am an artist. I'm a field recordist, which means I'm someone who collects sounds. I go out and record things all over the place. And I'm a museologist, and I've been interested for a long time in fusing all of these interests. So I take great pride in telling you that this museum is an artist's museum, and that also helps serve as a sort of get-out-of-jail-free card for some of the things that I claim the museum does, and what I will be presenting to you today. So this particular artist's museum has been around for almost 3 years now. It opened on November 11th of 2015 with a grand opening gala and ribbon cutting ceremony at the London College of Communication. And sadly, the sound didn't work there. Anyway, the way the museum works is potential visitors usually go to the museum's website, museumofportablesound.com. They fill out an online form. We begin a conversation about where and when to meet. On the day of their visit, I show up to the place that we've agreed upon. I set up the museum, the phone. I also give them a map of the museum, which they're free to keep. And I also hand them this gallery guide, which is a publication that I've created to accompany their visit in the museum. The gallery guide contains all of the object information, labels, imagery, and didactic panels that would be on a typical museum's walls. And then we sit there while they listen to the museum. And I generally let them listen as long as they'd like. The lengths of visits have varied widely. There have been visits that have been a minute or so. There have been visits that have been 5 hours long. We do ask that everyone bring their own headphones for health and safety reasons. And we do apologize for any inconvenience caused. And group tours are available. We do have a headphone splitter, so feel free to bring a friend. So getting on to where this came from, about 10 years ago, I was doing a museum studies program at the University of Michigan, and that's where I first encountered Stephen Greenblatt's notion of museological resonance, which I'm sure many, if not all of you, already know about, but just in case, by resonance, Greenblatt means the power of the displayed object to reach out beyond its formal boundaries to a larger world. And what that essentially boils down to is he's talking about juxtapositions and conversations between objects and visitors, and between objects in the world. This, as an artist who works with sound and as someone who grew up in the 80s and 90s, this immediately made me think about mixtaping and that practice of sequencing and juxtaposing songs in order to communicate things to someone that you were giving a mixtape to. So that started me thinking about, could recorded sounds be exhibited as objects themselves related to human culture within a museum context, beyond just music? I'm interested in non-musical sounds much more than I'm interested in musical sounds. And I'm wondering, if this is a possibility, how would this affect what can be considered a museum, depending on how this is accomplished? So in order to begin thinking about how I would treat sounds as museum objects if I were to create such a museum, I went back to the sort of modernist originator of this idea of sounds as objects, to the French composer Pierre Schaeffer, who in the 1940s came up with a concept he called the objet sonore, which what he meant by it was recorded sounds that he would use as source material for musical composition. And through this, he created a type of music known as musique concrète. Nowadays, we know it more as sampling. And it's pretty much ubiquitous throughout the pop music business, for sure. And this term and Schaeffer's philosophies behind it have subsequently become almost passé within the sound studies and sound art and experimental music communities, to the point where this term is actually thought of as kind of tired and out of touch. And so I started thinking, well, maybe that belongs in a museum. So I decided to redefine Schaeffer's term, and yeah, the sound is really not working. I'm not sure what's going on, but I've played 3 sounds now, and none of them have played. So this is going to be a very big problem come later in the paper. But so anyone know anything about how this sound works? Let's see, let's go back. Sorry, it's never a good thing to repeat a joke, but I just need to do this to see if this is working. Okay, there we go. So, I figured it out.
Oh, great.
Sorry. So in thinking more and more about, once I had redefined the term as a museological term, I started thinking more and more about this idea of maybe opening up a museum. And if I did so, I would need to answer the architecture question, like where would this museum exist? And thinking in terms of, being modern and hip and all, and maybe I could do a virtual museum, right? So the thing about virtual museums, and ones that are, even ones that have a lot of money thrown behind them, is that they usually get bogged down with and ultimately fail because they waste too much effort trying to mimic the physical experience of walking through a museum. In most of the cases of virtual museums that I've researched, the designers always tend to think that the building is the museum rather than the objects and the stories that are told and the relationship with the visitors. So I decided to abandon that idea and not think about replicating architecture. I could put it on a phone. And if I did that, there's already an infrastructure on that phone for playing sounds. So if the phone equaled the building, then albums in the in the phone's music app would then equal the galleries. And then the tracks inside of each album would be objects. So the burning question is, why isn't it an app? I have some very concrete reasons why it isn't. So I have some objectives with this project. The first was I wanted to encourage attentive listening, which is something that really does not exist within contemporary society. When people are listening to recorded sounds, podcasts, music, whatever, it's usually as a backdrop to something else like exercising or commuting or dancing in your kitchen or catching up on 3 years of laundry. So I didn't want to do that. I wanted to encourage people to have a focused listening experience. Also, I was interested in whether or not it would be possible to make recorded sounds feel precious again, precious and worthy of being displayed within a museum. Because, okay, say I did create a Museum of Portable Sound app, where you could listen to the sounds online all the time, basically like Spotify. So then it's pretty much Spotify. It's always on, it's always available, and it's always mundane. Now we've come to think of music as something that we can get anytime we want it, and we don't have to go through any effort. We just tap a couple of icons on our phone, and there we go. We get to hear exactly what we want. I was interested in making things like this feel more like things like this. So I realized that it was in my best interests to get rid of any online display of the sounds in the museum. So, what does that leave me with? It leaves me with this, which is a social experience of people sitting down, people listening, people talking and listening to each other. And I realized that this is essentially a huge scenario of resonance and meaning making after I finally had visitors visiting the museum. And this is an experience I've had dozens, if not hundreds of times so far over the past 3 years. And actually, based on the feedback that I've gotten, people really do like the fact that it's not an app. And although these are jokes, these are actual representations of things that people have said to me. And also, the phone itself is basically a portable contact zone. And contact zones, as Heidi Geismar recently referred to them in an excellent book called Museum Object Lessons for the Digital Age. She calls them a material mediator between collections and ideas, people and things, modes of analysis, and forms of experience. They're containers of knowledge and a provoker of questions, and that's exactly what this phone has become. So in terms of how the museum is set up to display sounds, the general taxonomy is based on mixtapes, but they're mixtapes of mixtapes of mixtapes. So we've got the museum itself, which is essentially one giant mixtape. The museum has 4 main topic categories, each of which are then also possibly could be considered a mixtape. Each of those 4 categories have galleries that they've been divided up into, each of which is a mixtape. And even inside of those galleries, there are subgroups of objects that have been organized according to various different organization methods. So essentially, it's a giant Russian doll of mixtapes. So what are these mixtapes? Well, at the moment, there are 23 galleries within the 4 primary subject areas. There are 200 objects within those 23 galleries, and it lasts 5 hours if you want to listen to the whole thing. And I have designed it so that it could be listened to straight through, and there would, if you were paying enough attention, you would see that it has actually been designed in a way to lead you on on a linear experience, if that is the way you choose to visit. Most people don't. I have had one person actually sit through and listen to the entire thing straight through without warning me, which was really interesting. But in setting the museum up this way, though, it turns out that I ended up approximating museum architecture anyway, because I had these 4 categories. They were each 4 floors. So these are now my permanent collection galleries. So I just want to very quickly walk you through the 4 main categories and explain how this is supposed to work if it were to be experienced linearly. The first category is natural history. It has sounds related to things like animals, insects, weather, and water. I refer to this as the easy listening section of the museum because people are very used to listening to sounds of the earth and sounds of nature. There's a huge amount of familiarity here, especially since Irv Teibel's Environments LP series in the 60s and 70s, which actually became chart hits, at least in the US. I'm not sure if they did here. Second, there's the science and technology section. This is where things get a little rough. The first gallery is called Laboratories in Medicine. This is meant to stimulate a sort of awareness of the body and its relationship to sound. Then there's sort of the how and why of recorded sound. There's galleries devoted to acoustics and the history of audio recording, and even the sounds of home audio equipment from the past 2 centuries. There's also, this introduces the notion of design sounds, so there's audio interfaces. There's also sounds of wayfinding and analysis. And in terms of analysis, the sounds of glitches are amazing. When you hear a glitch, you know your computer's not working, you know your phone's not working, you know what a glitch is before you've even experienced it. Then third is space and architecture. These are signs of architectural spaces. It emphasizes the relationship between sound and space, which you kind of can't have one without the other in some respects. But these are also sounds of the everyday, the overlooked, the unheard. Sounds that we learn to live with and we learn to tune out, because if we didn't tune them all out, if we didn't tune at least some of them out, we would go insane. And that's not just hyperbole. Finally, the final section is called Art and Culture. This is, to me, the meat and potatoes of the museum. It's the section that's closest to my heart. This is where the museum really starts to come down heavy on the cultural roles of sounds, how sound operates within culture, and not just musical sound. Music is not the only form of sound that is culture. I'm very adamant about that. It also covers the sound vision hierarchy and attempts to upend that in several respects. There's also attention given to collection and exhibition practices themselves. So there are sounds of libraries and archives. There's a very large gallery of museum sounds. That's one of the things I do. I record the sounds of museums. And then it ends up, the very last gallery is devoted to exhibitions of sound that I've attended. So you end up listening to the thing you've been doing all along, which I'm a fan of, balance and things like that in visual design as well as audio design. So I just want to very quickly show you what I'm talking about in terms of sound marks and how this operates in terms of sounds and culture. So one of the typologies I have in Gallery 7, the audio interfaces gallery, is street crossing signals for the visually impaired. This is another thing that I collect everywhere I go. In the current version of the museum, there are 8 of them. I have a lot more, and I'm going to be adding more and more as the museum continues to expand. But I just want to play 3 of them for you, very, very brief excerpts first. Here's one from Ann Arbor, Michigan in the United States.
What sign is on? What sign is on?
Here's one from Zagreb. And I don't know why it's not showing you the image, but this is one from Aarhus in Denmark. So as you can see or hear, all 3 of those sounded very different from each other. And in my opinion, they actually kind of reflect something about the local culture, especially when you think about people having to walk across streets that are playing these sounds every day, whether they're sighted or not sighted. This becomes part of their acoustic landscape. And R. Murray Schafer, the Canadian composer who coined the term sound mark, he describes them as a site-specific sound that becomes an identifier of a community. His main example of a sound mark was church bells or clock bells. And I also make recordings of those. I did make a recording of the final bongs of Big Ben the day that they turned it off. So I just want to show you a very quick snippet of that. Please. It's not really something that seems very boring, does it? In Schafer's terms, he says once a sound mark has been identified, it deserves to be protected, for sound marks make the acoustic life of a community unique. Now, to me, this is starting to sound a little bit like intangible cultural heritage. And I'm sure most of you are aware of UNESCO's definition of what intangible cultural heritage is, but I just want to unpack it quickly. What does it talk about? Who and what is it protecting? It's protecting traditions or living expressions inherited from our ancestors and passed on to our descendants. So we've got the past and we've got the future. But what about the present? What about the stuff that's going on now? Also, in terms of what intangible culture is meant to represent, it represents things like oral traditions, performing arts, social practices, rituals, and festive events. These are all sort of special things. But what about the everyday? There's a lot of stuff that goes on that is culture in the everyday. So what I'm suggesting is that maybe it would be kind of nice if it were possible to expand UNESCO's definition to include not only post-industrial sounds, but audio recordings themselves as intangible culture, so that we can have sort of an expanded notion of intangible cultural heritage that I think might actually turn out to be a bit of a hit if it were done. And once again, the sound didn't work. But thank you very much.
Thank you, John, for that fascinating insight in a very big but very small institution at the same time. I'd like to ask both speakers to come up, and because we're a little bit behind schedule, I'd like to open it up to the audience straight away before we move on to our next speaker, Sussan Babaie. And I'd like to ask you to maybe ask questions that maybe require a short answer, if that's an option. So they have to be very good questions.
John, thank you very much for putting a framework around what I didn't realize, that I had a collection of that belongs to a museum. I've been collecting sound, household sounds of my childhood, going back to my parents' house, recording the way a door sounds, the way a cupboard sounds. Perhaps there might be room for sort of exchange of audio. Also, sounds of what fascinates me is aircraft announcements. Particularly, I have a nice collection of the Iranian Airlines and their welcoming passengers in 2 languages. Fascinating. Thank you very much for that. Very innovative.
Thank you.
That's a short answer and a very good question. Can I ask for one more question? Theo?
There was one.
Oh, I didn't see that one. Yes, go ahead.
I was wondering, John, do you add any interpretation to the sounds?
Yes, every sound has text related to it.
Like in the actual museum, or is it all held in the book?
No, it's in the book. There are some videos on the phone. Like our current temporary exhibition is a video. It's our first visual exhibition, but no, the interpretive material is all in the book, which is also a PDF on the museum's website.
Then I'm gonna Theo, and then one more question there, and then we're gonna move on. Yes.
Thank you both very much. There's a lot of discussion about the relation of art history to visual culture, and what the two talks together seem to bring up is the relation of art history to oral culture. So could you maybe talk a bit more about where the tensions might be there, and if they're different tensions to the ones that relate to art history and visual culture?
I'm not sure how quickly I can do it. The tensions between art history and visual culture are long rehearsed, right? So depends what you think we mean by visual culture. I tend to have a fairly neutral and inclusive definition of that. I like to use the term visual and material culture rather than art history when I'm talking about things that were not created to be, art for art's sake type art. So that's how I use it. And I think oral culture would be the same for me, that as John made the point in his own talk, that I'm not just interested in music, but I'm interested in bells and the sounds of people walking and clocks ticking and all of those other things which fit into a culture which is wider than just the sort of curated and composed sounds. So I think the term oral culture works in a similar way for me as the term visual culture, to allow you to encompass a number of other things that you might wish to include in your investigations into what makes humans do what they do.
Yeah, I would definitely agree with that. I think the more data we can gather from as many senses as possible, even beyond the 5 that are accepted in Western thinking, I think the better. I mean, we're trying to study human experience, and by only focusing on the visual for the vast amount of cultural writings there are, to me seems extremely short-sighted. Forgive the pun.
And the last question.
A very quick
question.
Yes.
I'd like to know, like, how would you open up the access for the public to engage into, actually it's a question to John, to engage the public so that they can also submit what they observe from their daily life. And also, I wonder if this platform will be opened up in a global level, and how people can really participate.
That's actually, those types of practices have been going on for quite a while. There are quite a lot of online sound maps that I think are, that cover that very well. What they focus on usually is the geographic aspect of it. What I'm interested in is showing how museums can display non-visual culture. So aside from the fact that I view this as an artist museum and actually something of a self-portrait, I'm also very much interested in exploring ways that sounds can be curated. And by opening it up to just anyone to submit sounds, to me, that's not an area that I'm personally interested in at the moment, although I am interested in opening up, well, there are talks of franchising it, so to other cities. So mine is London-based. I have artists in a couple of other cities that are interested in opening up their own versions, including their own sounds rather than mine. So the idea is to sort of Guggenheim it and move it around to different cities, and then we would share collections between each other. And when that would happen, like if the London architecture section went on tour in Alexandria, which is one of the potential cities, it would no longer be on the London phone while it was in Alexandria. So.
On Guggenheiming it a bit, I'd like to thank our speakers one more time. And I would like to welcome our last speaker in this first afternoon session, Dr. Sussan Babaie, who is going to talk to us about something very exciting, Zauk, is that how I say it? In Persian, between the visual and culinary, which will lead us right into our curated lunch. Welcome, Sussan Babaie.
Thank you. I'm sure you're hungry, and who needs to hear about yet another project on food and taste and art before lunch? But here we go. Hopefully it helps, actually. So I want to start by saying that I'm the beneficiary of a very generous Andrew W. Mellon grant to the Courtauld, which was for a post in Asian arts. And I teach the part of the Asian arts that is Persianate, that is Islamic, West, Central, and South Asia. And we call it Persianate because the language of high culture after the Mongol period, Mongol invasions, becomes Persian, the same language that today is spoken in much of this area as well. This that I present here is a fraction of a book project, and you have to forgive me if it doesn't completely cohere, because I'm trying to give you a sense or a taste, so to speak, of it. So I start by pointing to the fact that pictorial representations of feasting, eating together, drinking together, which are known as basm, within a social space, a social setting, are among the most standard of themes deployed in Persian manuscript paintings since at least the 14th century. And this notion of kings and heroes of the classical Persian epic and romantic tales, of which the most important is the Shahnameh, the Book of Kings, is embedded in this notion of feasting after a hunt or a victory in war, and are always imagined in a palace pavilion or an outdoor picnic area. Is this working actually for me as well? Yeah, okay. In these scenes, cups, bottles, fruits scattered on the floor or piled in platters evoke the commensality of the depicted scene. And I'm not going to point to them, but because conventions of Persian painting are slightly more challenging, I just want to point here that this man is grilling a bird over open fire, for instance, and there are dishes with covers over them that are being delivered. In other words, there is a lot of such materials scattered in these paintings, usually, however, ignored as doodads, as filling items in paintings where the primary focus is the protagonist and the story that presumably is the goal of this painting, in fact. While we take note of them in general, we also haven't taken note, that is scholarship, of the fact that before the early modern period, depictions of people actually making food or touching fruits and food, a cup of wine, let alone tasting the thing that is intended for their gathering, are rare, if at all present, in paintings, Persian painting, of the early modern period. So prior to, say, late 15th century, and particularly 16th and 17th centuries, such images where you see someone eating or cooking or serving food as such is extremely rare. The one exception is in the depictions of the story of Yusuf and Zulaykha, Joseph and Potiphar's wife, when she invites her maidens to prove to them that the beauty of Yusuf is irresistible. Persian artists focus the scene on the moment when the women are holding a fruit in one hand and a knife in the other, and as they are about to cut into the fruit, Yusuf is asked to come in, and as he enters, they all lose, at the sight of Yusuf, they all lose all control and continue to cut, now into their fingers instead of the fruit. The fruits in these paintings vary. They can be apples and pomegranates, but I have seen cucumbers as well. The Quranic adaptation of the biblical story was repeatedly recomposed in Persian poetry and was enormously popular in Persian painting, often interpreted as a reference to the mystical yearning of the soul for the beauty of the divine. Those depictions of Yusuf and the women of Egypt are provocative of indeed much more than only the mystical connotations. They are indeed redolent of sexual and sensory tensions, a subject for another time. But what interests me in the depictions of Yusuf and Zulaykha is the implicit thread drawn here between the beauty seen and the beauty consumed or implied to be consumed or eaten. This part is a potential neurological thread, which I'm also considering in this larger research, though not fully understanding all the details of it. So I'm asking for help from neurologists and scientists in this regard. The paintings of Yusuf and Zulaykha have, in fact, served me as an entry into the potentialities embedded in the interlinked representations of the visual and the gustatory taste. That proposition, I want to suggest, is capable of intimating the edibility of the beautiful. It is mainly in the mystical realm that the Islamic notion of taste acquires its principal meanings. Zawq or dhawq, Arabic pronunciation of the term that in Persian is pronounced as zawq, is the Arabic root for the for taste, actually. It has been discussed in Islamic literature in terms of taste, not so much in its reference to sense perception of taste, as in its broader philosophical and religio-mystical connotations of joy, pleasure, and desire. In all these permutations of the concept of zawq, it is the transcendental meanings that dominates its usage and interpretations in modern scholarship. Sense of and sensitivity to the extra-physical connotations of zawq in Sufi literature do include, actually, the partaking in communal situations of the blessed food for its barakat, its blessing, especially when it is distributed out of holy shrines. So there is a concept of zawq that is related to actual food, but that's not how it is interpreted. The great Anna-Marie Schimmel, the eminent scholar of poetry and Sufism in Islam, situated the Sufi experience of bliss through the phenomenological study of the signs of God, and in terms of the joyous, even rapturous experience of the taste of spiritual bliss, the zawq of that notion. Readings into the Sufi poetics in Persian language explicate an aesthetic theory, for instance, from the poetry of the 14th century mystic Mahmud Shabestari, who was himself a follower of the great Ibn al-Arabi of the 12th, early 13th century. And their writings encapsulate in the concept of zawq a notion one can call the theosophy of poetic inspiration and creative intuition. To attain to the mystical knowledge of the divine, the Sufi considers zawq as the precondition and a means through which the seeker tastes the sweetness of union, just as one must taste honey to gain knowledge of its sweetness. Taste, in its conception as zawq, an extra-rational experience so beloved of Persian mystical poetry, indeed represents a symbolic understanding of the sense perception of taste. My argument here, and in the book that I'm working on, however, tends towards the tangible experience of the organs that facilitate taste, that connect sense perception through taste buds and eyesight. This is, in other words, more anthropological, and art history, or history of art, is indeed very much connected to anthropology than mystical in approach, although not entirely uninterested in the mystical dimensions, as for instance, wine drinking and intoxication are so deeply embedded in Persian poetic language of subjugating the conscious on the path to the unconscious joy of attaining union. I'm trying to get away from that as best as I can. In Making Sense of Taste, the title of a book by Caroline Korsmeyer, A Study of Food and Philosophy, she argues that where vision carries a certain ethical weight in aesthetic terms, given its general association, especially in European cultures, with higher faculties of human perception, taste is considered too base, too subjective, too much of a bodily function. Thus, gustatory taste is omitted on the assumption that it lacks the ability to make aesthetic discrimination regarding objects of art. Although the metaphor of taste is deployed in theories of aesthetic perception and evaluation, taste is not considered a reliable conduit for access to what philosophy attributes primarily to the sense of sight and hearing. But that the two, gustatory taste and vision, as Korsmeyer argues, belong to the same epistemology of sense perception, is especially relevant here to my thinking and is further implicated in the tantalizing tidbits found, as I want to briefly sketch here, in such contexts as cookery treatises, paintings, and ceramic objects, made and decorated for food consumption, the kinds of things that might have been hinted at in these paintings, and especially this mural painting, or a detail of. The extraordinary clustering. Do I need any of this? No. The extraordinary clustering of material evidence in the early modern Persian world indicates a heightened awareness and preoccupation with the sensory experience of taste, when taste becomes the subject for the aesthetic imagination of the period. This is where I'm going, essentially looking at taste from the point of view of the visual, the artistic, the aesthetics of a period, but also in terms of the actual objects, foods, and the sort of protocols of consumption of all of that, in a way. And here I have picked a sampling of the kinds of images that proliferate at the very end of 15th century and then just explosively appear all over the place in Persian art of this period, and especially in the depictions in the visual culture of the Persian-speaking world of this implied sensory experiences that relate to the touch and taste of food stuff, of things that are consumed, essentially. There's a whole lot more to this. Smell, obviously, sound, and Beth's talk made me think of the musical instruments and the presence of musical instruments. This is a field of study that tends to sort of pick apart images in terms of the particularity of perhaps an iconography, but to put them together into sensory experiences is something yet to be done. So these spread out in manuscript paintings, in single album paintings, and wall paintings, and indeed this massive number of representations that actually bring out acts of eating or tasting, or with compelling tangibility imply that, such as, and this is a very unusual one, to have the cook here with the instruments he needs and he's tasting food. It's extraordinary for Persian painting to have such images, in fact. And to illustrate the point, I want to take one particular image. It's a very strange image for all those handlebar mustaches that proliferate in the 17th century in Persian painting, based on the handlebar mustache made famous by Shah Abbas the Great. So an image like this of a court gathering, which comes from an album of single-sheet paintings and calligraphic samples, and now at the Walters Art Museum, underscores in pictorial terms the prominence given to tactile evocations of sensory experience. Here on the two sides of the composition, we see there's a brook, a little water channel that goes through, but on each side the company is engaged in some form or fashion with acts of touching, exchanging, and potentially tasting fruits, actually. The unusual aspect of this painting lies in those gestures that imply imminent delight in tasting a fruit or tasting the wine, actually. Contemporary to this painting is the massive program of mural decoration of the mid-17th century audience hall of the Palace of Chehel-Sutun in Isfahan, which was the capital of the Safavid Empire, a competitive world in relation to, for instance, Istanbul or Delhi. Here, again, we come across a number of cases of feasting scenes, where Shah Abbas, for instance, is hosting an Uzbek ruler. And here again, a feast is used as an excuse or a diplomatic occasion is used as an excuse for the conveyance of a series of sort of politically charged meanings that are embedded in hosting a feast, hosting a deposed ruler, sharing food with the deposed ruler, subjects that I have worked on as an architectural historian, actually, with regards to these buildings. Here I want to focus attention on two vignettes, which are very much relevant to the discussion. The one on the left-hand side here and the one on the right-hand side here. The two young women seated in the lower left of the composition and the male duo with one of them in a reclining pose on the lower right of the mural. In both vignettes, gestures and objects depict rather subtly sexually charged action. The girls used a long sash, which is red-colored, worn around the crotch of one of them to perform a pleasurable embrace, to put it rather mildly and timidly. In the men's section, this is extraordinary for the fact that it is in a hugely important official audience hall. Why is it there is another subject altogether. In the men's section, the youth's pose of recline with curved back and crossed legs is contrasted by the upright seated figure of the older man here, who invites the viewer to see him hold the head of the youth while dangling a ripe fruit, seems to be a pear, just above his parted lips. The sexual evocations in these two vignettes are in fact made all the more compelling by the use of fruits and drinks indeed, the girl holding a cup of wine to her partner and the man with the pear-shaped fruit near the mouth of his partner. The sensuality embodied by these details, which evoke, moreover, indeed, sensory experiences of sound and touch and potentially smell, is enhanced by the multiple ways of representing the sensory experiences of foodstuffs, the cups and bottles and dishes of fruits that are set on cloths in front of guests and entertainers, the covered platters of food, the shaw's gesture of offering a cup of wine. Up here, this is a famous picture, was all over London tube stations when the museum, British Museum, had an exhibition about Shah Abbas. But these sorts of details, of suggestive details, make you wonder about how the eye is engaged in rethinking, reimagining, repopulating the sensory experiences in a painting such as this. And of these, there are numerous, there are at least 3 of them in this same hall, in fact. I wonder also, and this is my segue to something else, which is, I wonder, and have worked on this a bit, about this figure here, the only man seated among these corpulent row of seated men with their dramatic mustaches a la Shah Abbas, who seems to be distinct by the fact that he doesn't wear any armor. These are mostly ceremonial armor. He looks straight at us, and he's the only one who is receiving a cup of wine, actually, from the young Sari, the wine bearer. Here I want to hazard a guess, and I ask you to indulge me in this because there is a bigger project at stake here, that this man may very well be the representation or evocation, if you will, of the famous personal chef of Shah Abbas, whom we know by name, Nurullah, and who is the author of a very important cookery treatise. Despite the seemingly lowly rank of a cook in the vast royal apparatus of the Safavid Empire, and well before we come to fixate on Francocentric notions of high cuisine, Nurullah had indeed found ways to spotlight his stardom. He was the author of this highly sophisticated treatise on the art of cooking. The author there claims to high rank, which comes not only from the act or the fact of its dedication to the Shah, but most audaciously his claim to knowledge of recipes he has invented, quite a number of them. This is a moment of invention of recipes, hundreds of recipes. Recipes that are also associated with the shahs themselves, for either the invention or refinement of those, and references to famous contemporary chefs, including a definition of what makes a master chef. These are clever markers, I think, of a social context, but are also tethered to the court and the imperial administration at one level, and to a professional genealogy within which Nurullah situates himself. This is exactly the same kind of strategy that a master artist uses in this period, or a master calligrapher uses in this period, in situating a genealogy into which they fit. While the identity of the corpulent figure in the Chehel Sutun mural may remain elusive, it is in light of such details of a social life of food and its related worlds that my suggestion here, I hope, may be tolerated. One final note I want to make, and I'm getting very close to lunch, is about culinary categories of vessels, which are the substantial component of what we might call Islamic luxury arts. Yet food and cooking, the material and activities directly related to these objects, have scarcely been implicated in our historical scholarship. There is, of course, an acknowledgement, for instance, of the appearance of wide platters in Iranian ceramics, and they are really large and wide, very unusual, because if you compare them to, for instance, the Chinese porcelain versions or others like the Ottoman ones, these are quite large, and they are clearly made for the delivery of rice. And those hundreds of new rice dishes seem to be all coming together at the same time. So it's after the Mongol invasions, in fact, that rice is introduced in the Persian world, or the West Asia, Central Asia, South Asia. And that's one of the sort of the hinges here. In cases both of cookbooks, of which two very important ones come to us, and art, both objects and paintings, we are still to consider how food and taste might play a role in our understanding of the processes of making culinary knowledge and artistic knowledge in conjunction with one another, and using the two of them as tools for the transmission of a cultural memory, especially as part of urbanity, but most importantly, as items within this construct of taste of a certain time and place. A glance at mass displays of tableware, and these are from the V&A's top floor. If you haven't been there, this is one of the most fantastic parts of the V&A, I think. This reveals certain types of objects to be more prominent, let's say, in Safavid cases than in their contemporary Ottoman ones. Significant numbers of wine bottles and cups, and I mean significant. Hardly any wine bottles seem to come to us from the courtly sort of tableware of Ottomans. And a staggering number of enormous flat plates speak of certain Iranian food habits, while also the conspicuous absence of some other kinds of dishes, like these large, deep bowls of Iznik variety, which are famous, point to food types not so important in the Persian context. Interesting as well are the staggering number of small plates and cups and bowls, all of which relate to the choreographies of food presentation consumption in these feasts. The French Huguenot jeweler and merchant Jean Chardin writes, for example, that in delivering each course of the meal, dishes are distinguished in shapes and sizes, but also in categories, as sweet starters, followed by savory, then stews, and finally, pilaw, he calls it. That's the Persian rice, polo. Each person, he observes, has 15 or 20 little plates set in front of him and large porcelain or gold bowls which hold about 2 pints of sherbet, and in each of which is a boxwood spoon. He goes on to talk about details, and there are other ones. Extraordinary detail of dishes and dishes, food, dishes, seen at Safavid courtly and elite banquets. And in these, we find not just the interest is not matching them together, but to think of the shared taste, if you will, in these contexts. It is, there are, of course, culinary agricultural explanations for many particularities of food habits. Rice, as I said, comes into the West Asian site after the Mongol invasions, but rice, always a main staple of food in China, India, and in fact, the entirety of Eastern and Southern Asia, as well as the former Ottoman Mediterranean, is very special in Iranian cookery and remains a special category of food, a rarefied and complex aspect of Persian cuisine requiring complicated methods of preparation unique to Iranian geography, in fact, and you will taste them in a moment. Not only were the generously sized platters a matter of necessity, they were also an important component of the visual aesthetics of food and its corollary signal of gustatory taste. That sort of sensibility comes through in Nurullah's cookbook, in which he says, that chef that I was talking about, in which he actually talks about the art of cooking, san'at tabakhi, to require agility to cook well with speed. He also admonishes those rival master chefs who advise their apprentices, and I quote, to cook badly but serve beautifully, noting his apparent disdain for the exaggerated emphasis on the serving style or the look of the food over its taste. This to me is significant, not only because it emphasizes the taste factor, that is gustatory taste, but also, and perhaps more importantly for my purposes, it points indirectly to the rise in the affectations, in the manner of presenting, and I want to suggest representing, of food. These offer intriguing glimpses into a well-defined categorizing of sensory experiences, and especially of the dimensions of taste between eating and seeing. They appear additionally to represent a degree of culinary refinement that is not just a matter of courtly practice. In fact, I have an argument that these are activated widely across urban experiences in the city of Esfahan. And as may be suggested from the proliferation of pictorial concerns with food, cooking, and eating parties from the late 15th through the 17th centuries, these sensory-rich approaches to taste, gustatory and visual, and their context of sociable gatherings, the chance to show the platter, the rice dish, and their interlinked experiences collectively further underscore the wide dissemination of the interest in and the rise of food culture in Safavid era. There is a corollary to this, which is the sex culture in Safavid era. What here, however, I want to call visio-aesthetic culinarity. An argument can be made, albeit not here, that the simultaneous rise to prominence of treatises on art, as much as on cooking, point to the shared language and their visio-aesthetic sensibilities in the recipes for making various pigments as much as dishes. Thank you.